Okay, well, that last one, a little bit dense, got into the weeds a little bit, but we're going to talk about something that is very practical, at least in terms of trying to ward off objections to Christianity, because we're going to be talking about the problem of evil. I should turn myself on so that people can hear me on the live stream. Sorry, people on the live stream. So the problem of evil. This is probably the most famous, the most common objection to Christianity. However, I don't want you to lose sight of what we talked about last night, right? So last night, we brought things into a framework, clarification, evidence, setting up a target. So as I'm going through this, keep that in your mind, and I'll call your attention to it, but I want you to keep that in your mind. So as an illustration of the problem of evil, I like to share an anecdote that I found online from C.S. Friedman. She's Jewish, and it concerns her reflections on the Holocaust. She says, quote, "I have had many friends who pray to Jesus for trivial things, minor daily trials, some of whom honestly believe that God is constantly doing small things to make their lives easier, like helping them get a job interview or helping their children. I've given up trying to explain why that very concept is offensive to Jews. If God exists, and he cares enough to ease the fever of a little kid with the flu, what was up during the Holocaust? Weren't enough little kids suffering back then? Someone once asked me what I would do if I found out that I was wrong in my atheism. And when I died, I found myself standing before the throne of God for judgment. What would I say to God then? I would say, where were you in 1943? If he exists, he owes us an explanation. People often ask, how can you call yourself a Jew and be an atheist? My answer is that for many of us, that is the only way we can be Jews. A little bit closer to home, when I was in school, one of my professors related a story about when he was a preacher. There was a family at his congregation who had a young child, and they were doing some landscaping in their yard. And over the course of their landscaping, they had brought in some concrete tiles that they were going to use for a sidewalk beside their house. Well, these concrete tiles were leaning up beside the house, and their kid had gone out to play. And, for whatever reason, there was a lapse in supervision. That child knocked over one of those concrete tiles onto itself, and the child dies. That event drove that family away from God, away from the church. For them, it made absolutely no sense why God would allow something like that to happen, so they gave up in their belief in God. If you live in the world long enough, you won't have to seek out this problem of evil. It will find you. Our world has evil in it. And I would say with reasonable confidence that almost everyone in here has already encountered it. You've already encountered evil in your life. So one of the critical tasks of Christian apologetics is to meet this challenge and try to show that belief in God remains reasonable even in the face of a world enveloped with evil and suffering. But to do this effectively, it's important to understand that this problem comes in different ways, different facets, different classifications. There's two big ones. There's the intellectual and there's the emotional. The intellectual problem of evil, the emotional problem of evil. The intellectual problem concerns arguments, premises, conclusions, soundness, validity. The emotional concerns one's own emotional investment in whether or not God exists. To deal with the intellectual problem, if you provide emotional solutions, then you're going to sound frivolous and unthoughtful. But if you respond to the emotional problem of evil with intellectual arguments, then you're going to seem uncaring and cold and robotic and unsensitive. So, how do you determine what kind of problem the person that's talking to you is raising? Clarification. You need to understand exactly what this person's objection is before you respond. So, in this lecture, we'll deal with both of them, but you need to figure out if the person is speaking in intellectual terms or emotional terms. And you don't want to say, are you raising the intellectual problem of evil, or are you just being emotional? That's not going to go well, all right? You need to be tactful about this. Ask them what they think evil has to do with God's existence. In your mind, what's the relationship between evil and God? Or maybe you could say, it's interesting that you would select that particular objection. Is there any reason that you would pick that one specifically? Because that question might uncover the fact that there is some kind of personal trauma lurking behind the question. And then you can deal with that more effectively, more sensitively, than had you just rushed in with all of your refutations. So, the first step of clarification is absolutely essential here. So, we clarify. But then, that second step, evidence. How did you come to that conclusion? So if they are raising the intellectual problem, then what they are saying is there is something about the evil in the world that makes the existence of God either impossible or improbable. That's what they've got to be saying. Okay, at that point, who's making the claim? The skeptic. And what's our rule? No free rides. No more free rides. If they say, well, evil exists, so I just can't believe that God exists, you have to say, so when you say that you just can't believe, why is that? And then the onus is on them to actually spell out the argument, right? It's not your job to refute it. It's their job to lay out the argument. So they say, well, it just seems to me impossible that God would ever create a world with this much evil in it. And then your next question, what would make you believe that? What convinced you that that was the case? They have to spell their argument out, then you can start to deal with their reasons. But don't just rush in guns a-blazing. Clarify, and then ask for their reasons. For example, one of the most popular formulations of this argument comes from David Hume. He was a Scottish philosopher, very influential, but here is how David Hume expressed this problem. Quote, "Is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Well, then he is impotent. Is he able, but not willing? Well, then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Well, then whence then is evil?" Now, at first glance, this seems like a pretty formidable argument. It seems like the theist is really kind of painted into a corner here. However, upon closer inspection, the argument becomes much less defensible. Let's jump to something that Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga had to say about this kind of formulation. So Alvin Plantinga, one of the foremost Christian philosophers, still alive, but he's past his philosophical analysis days. But Plantinga wrote a book called God, Freedom, and Evil. And in it, he says this, quote, "Suppose that the theist admits that he just doesn't know why God permits evil. What follows from that? Very little of interest. Why suppose that if God does have a good reason for permitting evil, that the theist would be the first to know? Suppose God has a good reason, but that reason is too complicated for us to understand, or perhaps he has not revealed it for some other reason. The fact that the theist doesn't know why God permits evil is perhaps an interesting fact about the theist, but by itself, it shows little or nothing relevant to the rationality of belief in God. Much more is needed for the atheological argument even to get off the ground." What is Plantinga doing? He is asking the question, how did you come to that conclusion? Give me your argument. All Hume has done is asked questions. See, Plantinga is abiding by the rules of the burden of proof. He is under no obligation to answer every question the atheist throws at him, else his belief in God is irrational. Rather, it is the atheist who is saying that belief in God is irrational, and as such, it is the atheist's job to present an argument. Questions are not arguments. As it turns out, it's actually rather difficult to formulate Hume's questions into a good argument. Atheists have been trying to do it for a while, but Plantinga basically put the argument to bed. Nevertheless, here is how the argument was traditionally conceived of. This would be like on the far end of the intellectual problem. This is where someone's saying, okay, evil exists, therefore God does not exist. Evil and God are incompatible. You can have one or the other. If you have evil, you don't have God. If you have God, you don't have evil. So that's like on the far end of the spectrum when it comes to the problem of evil. So here's what the atheist has to start with. To start with, they have God is all-powerful, God is all-good, and God is all-knowing. That's what the atheist has to start with respect to God, and then they have evil exists. Now, somehow, they have got to get an argument out of that which leads to the conclusion, therefore, God does not exist. So how do they do that? How do you get from point A to point B there? Well, let's tease out a little bit of the implications that are necessary, the additional premises in this argument that's required. If God is all-powerful, then he can create any world that he wants. Okay, so that would be an implication of God is all-powerful, right? If God is all-powerful, then he can create any world that he wants. Therefore, God can create any world that he wants. If God is all-good, then he would want to create a world without evil and suffering. If God is all-knowing, then he would know which worlds had no evil and no suffering. And from that, it follows that if God is those three things, all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing, then he would create a world with no evil and no suffering. So that is essentially how this argument is built from the raw material that they have to start with. However, you'll notice that in our world, there is evil and there is suffering. So if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, then he would create a world with no evil and no suffering. And our world has evil and suffering. What does that imply about God? Well, either he doesn't exist, or if he exists, he's not all-powerful, not all-good, not all-knowing, or any combination of those three. So that's the conclusion of the argument. How might one respond, right? Because we've gone through clarification. It's the intellectual problem on the far end of the spectrum. Okay? What is your argument? There it is. If God is all-knowing, all-good, all-powerful, then he would create a world with no evil and suffering. But our world has evil and suffering, therefore God either doesn't exist or he's not those things. Now it's our turn, right? Now we need to start inspecting those walls, seeing if it can hold up that roof. And that's what Plantinga does. So let's think about one of those premises, namely that God can just create any world that he wants. Plantinga comes out of the gate saying, no, he can't. Now, we hear that, and we think, hold on, Mr. Plantinga. I thought you thought that God was all-powerful. And it seems to me that if God is all-powerful, then he can create any world that he wants. Plantinga says, he can't. Think about it. And I'm going to give you a modified example of the one that Plantinga gives. Is anyone planning on going out to eat tonight? Okay, let's just say, hypothetically, that someone was planning on going out to eat. Who would be willing to engage in this little exchange with me? Anyone? All right, we have a brave volunteer. Thank you. All right. So if you were to go out to eat, where would be one place that you would be considering? Chili's. Okay. So do you guys have a Waffle House here? Okay, what's like the worst restaurant here? I think cause some controversy here. McDonald's. Okay, let's go McDonald's, all right? That's a safe choice. All right. So, you have Chili's, that's a possibility. And what we're going to say is that every other restaurant in this area has just suffered catastrophic like power outage, right? So they're just not operational except for McDonald's, okay? So, Chili's or McDonald's. Now, before you tell me what your option, what your choice is, what are some of the factors that are going through your mind right here as you're weighing those two options? Like, what are the considerations?
So you got cost, you got time, you got direction, and how much time I have to spend at said restaurant.
Right, okay. So how much time you have to spend at the restaurant, the distance it is, the money that you're going to spend. Okay, so there's a lot of different factors that go into this, and I'm sure that part of those factors include, like, is it kid-friendly? Is it, whatever that's going to be, right? So given all of those factors, which one are you going to choose? Chili's or McDonald's?
Depends on the situation.
Okay, the situation tonight.
Tonight, probably McDonald's because for small people.
Okay, there we go. All right, so we've got Chili's on the one hand, McDonald's on the other, and we've just established that given all of the conditions that have led up to this exact moment, David will choose McDonald's. Okay? So, here's my question. Could David choose Chili's? Is that possible?
Yes.
Very possible. Will he? No. He's just told you he's going to choose McDonald's, right? It's possible that he goes to Chili's, but he's not going to. He's going to go to McDonald's. So, next question. Can God create a world in which everything leading up to this exact moment is exactly the same, and yet David chooses Chili's? He can't. He can't. We've just established that given these conditions, David will choose McDonald's. So, we have, David here, and we put him in this possible world where everything is the same to the actual world. Everything is the same. We put him in that world, drop him in there, boom, McDonald's. Okay, different possible world, but everything else is the same leading up to it. Put David in that world, boom, McDonald's. He will choose McDonald's. But there's a possible world in which he chooses Chili's. But God can't create that world because he's limited by the choices that David will make. Now, of course, there's a world in which God could force David to choose Chili's, right? But then that's a different world, right? Now David isn't freely choosing. You can't make someone freely do something. So, we've just established that there is a possible world in which Chili's is selected, but God cannot create that world because he's limited by free will. So, we've been speaking in terms of restaurants, but now let's move that to the moral realm. Suppose there's a world in which some person is tempted to, he's snapped and he's going to murder his boss, okay? And given the conditions that are leading up to that situation, this person will murder his boss. Can God create a world in which everything else is the same, and yet this person freely chooses to not murder his boss? He can't. Because given those conditions, the person will choose to murder his boss. Even though it's possible that he doesn't, he will. Let's back it up even further. Is it possible for Adam and Eve to have never sinned? Is that possible? I think it's possible. There's no logical contradiction there, right? It's possible for Adam and Eve to have never sinned. We could even broaden it. Is it possible for any other female and male pair to be placed in the Garden of Eden and never sin? Is that possible? Yes, it's logically possible. But suppose it's not feasible. It is not feasible for God to create any such world like that, because for any world in which he places a male-female pair in the conditions like the Garden of Eden, they will freely choose to sin. So there could be a whole host of possible worlds that are nevertheless impossible for God to create. They are not feasible for God because he has to take into account human free will. So, can God create just any world that he wants? No. There are plenty of worlds that are possible, but nevertheless are not feasible, because people will not cooperate. So, philosopher William Lane Craig says this, quote, "For all we know, it is possible that in any world of free persons," that's key, "for any world of free persons with as much good as the actual world, there would also be just as much suffering. On this basis alone, the atheist's argument fails." In other words, if God wanted to create a world with this much good, perhaps the only feasible world in which free creatures live in this world, there had to be this much evil. He can't just create any world that he wants. But that's not even the only problem. There's just one problem. What about this idea that an all-loving God would prefer a world without evil and suffering? Now, on the face of it, that sounds obvious, right? Of course, a good God would prefer a world without evil and suffering. But Plantinga says that that's far from obvious. After all, isn't it possible that God could have other overriding reasons for allowing the suffering in the world? For example, we all know of cases in which we permit certain levels of evil and suffering in order to produce a greater good. Has anyone ever been to the dentist? Why would you subject yourself to such evil and suffering? Because you know that that evil and suffering is necessary in order to accomplish the greater good. Having healthy teeth, getting that cavity removed, whatever the case may be. Right? So sometimes it is the case that a little bit of evil and suffering is necessary in order to accomplish some greater good. But there's another thing that comes into play here. Some goods are so tied in with evil that to remove the evil would be to remove the good. So, for example, if I break my finger, that's evil. That's suffering right there, okay? And suppose that there was this doctor that was way ahead of his time, and he said, "Aaron, I can get rid of that evil and suffering lickety-split. I'll have that hand off in no time. You won't feel any pain for the rest of your life." What am I going to choose? I'll keep the broken finger. Well, but wouldn't I prefer a world in which I experience no evil and no suffering? No. Because that little bit of evil is so tied up with this good that to have the evil removed would be to get rid of the greater good. So sometimes we need to permit a little bit of evil in order to have all of the good. And that's a better total situation than if the evil were removed and the good were also removed. Another situation. Sometimes the permitting of a little bit of evil and good prevents greater evil and suffering. So, illustration. The evil of the British Empire during the 1700s. That spawned the American experiment, right? If the British Empire were supremely good, what cause would there have been for the Declaration of Independence, right? If you read the Declaration of Independence, we all know like that first paragraph, but then like the whole body of it is just listing all the bad things that the British Empire was doing, right? So what if they weren't doing any of those things? We never get the first paragraph. Okay, so we remove the evil of the British Empire, and we remove, presumably, the founding of the American experiment. Okay, well then we fast forward. Hitler rises on the scene. Perhaps it is that without the rise of America, there is no force to withstand Hitler. And so, the removing of the British Empire gives rise to the German Empire. And which one do you think would have been worse? The German Empire. Okay, so removing some evils may give way to greater evils. So let's review. Would God prefer a world with no evil and suffering? That's far from obvious, because some evils lead to greater goods, some evils are so tied up with other goods that to remove the evil means to remove the good. And some evils are necessary in order to prevent giving way to greater evil. For any of those reasons, God may permit all of the evil that we see in the world. Maybe that's why there's evil. See, if God were to create a world with no evil and suffering, perhaps that would be like a parent that just keeps their kid inside, bubble wrapped, all the time. How much pain and suffering will that child endure? None. They will be perfectly safe. Would we prefer a world? Would parents prefer that their children just stay inside, bubble wrapped all the time? Why not? Well, because there are greater goods that they are being robbed from by removing the evil and the suffering that they would have to endure otherwise. It's good for kids to go out and play on the playground, even though they skin their knees and break their limbs and fall off and cry. It is better for them to endure that and get to play on the playground. So if God were to create a world with no evil and no suffering, maybe that would just be like God keeping us inside with bubble wrap all the time. Yeah, we'd never get hurt, but how much would we lose? So, those two holes that Plantinga pokes has effectively put this argument to bed. For these reasons, atheists have been very reluctant to resurrect this kind of argument. There's a couple that are still trying to do it, but this argument is pretty much put to bed. The far end of the intellectual spectrum, where it says, either pick God or evil. You can't have them both. Plantinga came in and pulled the rug out from underneath that. So they've had to amend their strategy. They're no longer saying that you either get to pick God or evil. They're incompatible. Now they are saying, well, there's just too much evil to make God's existence probable. So given the amount of evil that we see in the world, it's unlikely that God would permit it. Sure, he could permit it. It's possible, but it's unlikely. And so we've moved from what is called the logical problem to the probabilistic problem. It's unlikely that God would exist given all of this evil. And so let me spell out the argument, right? God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, right? We still have those. And then they've amended their premise. So long as it involves no logical impossibility, like making free creatures do things, God can create any world that he wants. Okay, so they've amended it. It's not just any world, it's any logically possible world, or any feasible world for God to create, where free will is kept intact. So long as it involves no logical impossibility or infeasibility, God can create any world that he wants. Of all of these feasible worlds, God would prefer to create the best of all of them. But given all the evil in the world, this world is probably not the best of all possible worlds. Therefore, God does not exist, probably. So the two key premises here, of all the feasible worlds for God to create, he would select the best of all of them. Given all of the evil in the world, this is probably not the best of all of them. Therefore, God probably does not exist. So that's the new argument that's being run. So what can we say about this? Well, a couple of issues that we can explore here. The first one is a little bit maybe surprising, but perhaps it is that there just is no best possible world. And that seems maybe a little bit strange. It seems like, well, of course there would be like a best possible world, wouldn't there? But think about it this way. Like, what would be like the best island? Well, maybe there's like resorts or like beachfront property, free food, all these different kinds of things. Okay, well, let's say you had all of those resorts. Couldn't you just add one more resort and it would be better? Or like just one more square inch of beachfront property and it would be better? And so then you make that island. Okay, well, couldn't you add one more square inch of beachfront property? Couldn't you add one more? So there's no actually like best possible island. And maybe there's a similar situation with worlds. Maybe there is no like best possible world, but it just keeps like increasing and increasing and increasing. So think about it this way. Wouldn't the best possible world be one in which everyone is happy and all these kinds of things? Well, instead of beachfront property, let's just add another person, right? Now we're just increasing total happiness. And so we just add another person, and another person, and another person. And it's like, well, the world's going to get too big. It's like, okay, we'll make another world, right? And then fill that with people. And then you add another world. So you just keep adding people, and there just is no limit. It just keeps getting better and better and better. So God would be within his rights to just say, you know what? One world, right? One earth, this many people, because there just is no best. Suppose also that whatever good we have in this world necessitates a certain level of evil, right? Just as we were talking about with Plantinga's response to the logical problem, he was saying that in order to achieve certain goods, you have to allow for certain evils. And so, if God wants to increase the amount of good in the world, what does he also have to permit? Greater amounts of evil. And so, as the good increases, the evil increases. And for all we know, this world has the optimal balance. For all we know, the amount of evil that is present in this world is just optimal for the amount of good that this world will experience. So as you increase those limits, there just is no best possible world. But that's maybe a minor criticism. Let's move to a more substantial one. The more substantial criticism would be that, so remind ourselves of the premise that this world is probably not the best of all possible worlds. So barring our criticism of the idea of there being a best world, the atheist is saying, no, too much evil, right? There's too much evil to say that this world even approaches the best of all of them. And against this, I'll return again to William Lane Craig. He offers 3 different criticisms. We maybe won't get to all of them. Let me just cover the first one to begin. The first thing that Craig says against this is that we are just not in a good position to say that it is improbable that God has good reasons for permitting the evil that we do see. And the key factor for the problem of evil, this version of the problem of evil, to get off the ground, is the linchpin which says that there is too much evil for God to be able to account for it. Like, that's the linchpin. The atheist has to be able to stand back and make the probabilistic assessment, nope, God probably doesn't have good reasons for this. There's probably too much evil. Question: how do they know that? How do you know that there is probably too much evil? In fact, I would say that we have good reasons for thinking that no one would be in a good position to make that kind of assessment. We are limited in time, in knowledge, in wisdom. God's unlimited in all of those. So who would be in a better position? God would. We're in a very bad position, honestly, right? In order to achieve God's ultimate ends, he may well have to allow a good deal of suffering along the way. Suffering which appears to be pointless to us within our own limited frame of reference, but it is justly permitted within God's wider frame of reference. Think about the dizzying complexity of our world. We are simply in no position to say with any confidence what kinds of evil are permitted or not, right? Think about that illustration that I gave with the removing of the British Empire, giving way to the German Empire. Would that have happened? Maybe. It could have happened, but who knows, right? You change one little thing, and who knows what kind of cascading effects that would have on the rest of human history. You could probably think back in your own lives, just a little insignificant thing that happened that eventually domino affected to something that you are dealing with today or enjoying today, right? Just little changes here and there have significant impacts. Every event that occurs sends ripple effects throughout history, such that God's reasoning for permitting it may not even emerge until centuries from now. Maybe in a different country, different part of the world. Only an all-knowing God can grasp the complexities of directing a world of free people toward his provisioned ends. Think of the innumerable, incalculable events that would be involved at arriving at one historic moment, right? We talked about World War II. Think about storming the beach at Normandy. What had to happen for that event to occur? Billions and billions of decisions, right? And not even just for that event. Who raised Winston Churchill? If a different person raises Winston Churchill, what happens during World War II? Who knows, right? Who knows? What about all of the generals that were involved? Who raised them? Who raised all of the soldiers? You're just going back one generation. Well, who raised all those people that raised all those people? Right? That's just the human element. Think about the dizzying complexity for storming the beach at Normandy. That's one historic event. Now multiply that for all the events in history. And you're going to say, no, there's probably too much evil. You're in no position to say so. We are in no position to say so. There's too much complexity. Too much. So once we contemplate God's providence over the whole of human history, I hope you can see how hopeless it is for finite, limited observers to speculate about the probability of whether God has some good reason for the suffering that we observe or not. We're simply not in a position to assess those kinds of probabilities with any confidence. So that's the first criticism. We're not in a good position to say so. But the second criticism is improbable with respect to what? See, probabilities are always with respect to something else. So, for example, I went to the Bear Valley Bible Institute. So let's take a sample of college students in America. What is the probability that any one of those college students drinks alcohol? Pretty high. Pretty high. I don't know the exact number, but it's pretty high. Okay, so the chances are really good that I was an alcohol drinker, right? Well, only with respect to all college-age people in America, right? Or all college students in America. But what if we were to add that additional bit of evidence that I was a Bear Valley student? And Bear Valley students, 0% of them are alcohol drinkers. Now what's the probability that I was drinking alcohol? 0, right? Okay, so you just went from very high to 0. What changed? The stuff you were plugging in to the equation. So what is the atheist plugging in to his equation? Is it just the evil in the world? Is that all they're plugging in? I mean, maybe if that's all you plug in, right? If all you plug into your equation is all of the bad stuff that has happened throughout all of human history, maybe it would be improbable that God existed. But what is that neglecting? Not only is it neglecting all the good things, but it's also neglecting all of the other arguments for God's existence. Like we just covered one, the Kalam cosmological argument, right? So you have to factor that in. Then there's the moral argument for God's existence. You have to factor that in. The teleological argument, the ontological argument, the argument from free will, all of these different arguments for God's existence. You've got Jesus' resurrection. You've got to factor that evidence in. You've got near-death experiences. You factor that in. Now it's not looking so improbable. If all you look at is evil, you might be able to reach the conclusion that God's existence is improbable. But if you widen your scope, and you look at God's existence with respect to the whole scope of evidence, well then, I think the equation becomes very different. So, not only are we in a very bad position to judge the probabilities, you also have to factor in all of the evidence if you're going to calculate that probability. And once you do that, it becomes much less obvious that God's existence is improbable. The third response, or the third criticism that Craig offers, is that Christianity in particular actually contains within it certain doctrines that make the presence of evil more probable on God's existence. More probable. So they increase the probability of the coexistence of God and suffering in the world. That is to say, if we're talking about the Christian God, then the argument from evil loses a lot of power. It's declawed, so to speak, because Christianity, the God of Christianity, is fairly compatible with the existence of evil. For example, these doctrines that he's referring to would include that the chief purpose of life is not happiness, but the knowledge of God. I think one of the reasons that the problem of evil has been so effective, especially in the Western world, is because in the Western world, the chief aim of humanity is happiness. Like, what is the American dream? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness? Pursuit of happiness, right? You buy a house, or you go to school, you get a good job, you buy a house, you get married, you have kids, you got lots of money, you retire, you die happy, right? Like, that is the American dream. It's all about self-gratification. Evil and suffering stands in the way of that. So if you think that the chief purpose of humanity is happiness, and that's why God has you on this earth, then why would God put so many impediments to the reason that he put you here? He didn't put you here for happiness. He put you here to know him, to be in relationship with him. We are not God's pets. The goal of human life is not happiness as such, but the knowledge of God, which in the end will produce true and everlasting human fulfillment. So, much of the suffering in life may be utterly pointless with respect to the goal of producing human happiness, but it may not be pointless with respect to the goal of producing a deeper knowledge of God. Indeed, it is often in times of great suffering that people rely on God most heavily. It may surprise you to hear that the Western world, society is moving in a secular direction. But that those societies which are undergoing tremendous hardship, places like Ecuador, or you can think historically of Mao's China, El Salvador, Ethiopia, these are all places where humans suffered a great deal. And yet it is in those countries that Christianity is growing the fastest. Why? Well, perhaps it is that it is through suffering that we come to rely on God more deeply. Could it be then that the suffering in this world may actually produce more knowledge of God than if there were no suffering? So if the atheist argument is going to show that the existence of the Christian God is improbable, then he's going to need to contend with that doctrine and others in order to show that the argument is effective not just against monotheism in general, but against Christianity in particular. So let's bring this to a close. You have two different kinds of problems of evil, the intellectual and the emotional. On the intellectual side, you've got the far end where they're saying you can either have God or you can have evil, but you can't have both. Plantinga put that to bed. God can't just create any world that he wants, and so his criticism's there. So they've moved to the probabilistic version, which says that God would probably create the best of all feasible worlds, and this is probably not the best of all feasible worlds, therefore God probably doesn't exist. Well, we're not in a good position to know what God would probably do or not. Further, there are certain doctrines in Christianity that actually make the presence of evil more probable. One of them is that life is not about happiness. It is about the knowledge of God. And perhaps it is only in a world that is suffused with evil that the maximum number of people would ever come into a saving relationship with him. And if that's the case, then evil is actually what we would expect if the Christian God were to exist. Now, this does not deal with the emotional problem. That will require more of a relational element. And often you'll find that once you uncover the varnish of the intellectual, it's the emotional problem lying underneath. And at that point you might say, well, why do we even deal with the intellectual problem if it's emotional all along? Well, because a lot of people think that they have an intellectual problem. So you have to deal with it. You have to. You need to meet people where they are at. But once you are able to move through the intellectual, if there is the emotional lying beyond it, that is where you need to switch into relational mode, to walk with that person, to try to comfort them, not to argue at them or with them, but to walk with them. That's the appropriate response, the emotional problem of evil. Because ultimately, the answer to the problem of evil is not an argument, it's not a syllogism, it's not a piece of evidence here that is lurking. The answer to the problem of evil is not a syllogism. It's a person. The person of Jesus. Because the problem of evil, as God looked down on our condition, he didn't give us an argument. He didn't give us a syllogism. He gave us his Son. And when he gave us his Son, he didn't give us his Son to give us an argument or a syllogism. He gave us his Son to suffer with us, to suffer for us. That is the ultimate answer to the problem of evil, the cross. And it's the cross that we will get to talk about tomorrow, Jesus' resurrection. That is the answer to the problem of evil. That there is a God who cares for us, who loves us, who wants to be in relationship with us. That's the answer, and that is what we have to offer to a world suffused with suffering and evil. Thank you.